Good day everyone, I'm Josel Arponce, BS Ed 3rd year Mathematics major, and I will present to you Module 3 Performance Standard, Competency, and Learning Targets in Mathematics. For today's learning outcomes, at the end of this lesson, students should be able to articulate performance standard into competency, performance standard, competency, and objectives, articulation of performance standard into competency, articulate competency into learning targets, articulation of competency into learning targets. Before I begin to discuss performance standard, I will first discuss standard. Standards are broad, overarching goals that will define the semester, unit, or the year. It's what the teacher teaches and the student learn. Example, grade 3 level subject mathematics, geometry. Standard CCSS Math Content 3. GA stands for geometry, reason with shapes and their attributes. There are many national organizations that have academic standard published. These include things like the National Council of Teacher of Mathematics or the National Council of Teacher of English, and these standards are often presented in grade level bands such as 6 through 8 or 9 through 12. All states have academic standards that had been published that their student must meet. Almost states use the Common Core State Standards or CCSS. The Common Core States Standard are educational standard for English language arts, ELA, literacy, and mathematics in grades K to 12. Also, important in these 21st century settings are the International Society for Technology in Education standards, and this organization publishes standards for teacher and student. And this is essential what you need to know in the digital world. Here are the standards for the K-12 basic education curriculum. Its learning standard, the learner demonstrates understanding and appreciation of key concepts and principles of mathematics as applied, using appropriate technology in problem solving, critical thinking, communicating, reasoning, making connection, representation, and decision in real life. Each case stages describe what learners should learn at the end of each year. For the grade level standards, it defines what the learners will learn from mathematics. It's involved numbers and number senses, geometry, patterns and algebra, measurement, statistics, and probability. Now let's proceed to content standard. According to Deep Ed Order Number 8 Series of 2015, content standard identified the sets, the essential knowledge and understanding that should be learned. It answered the question, what should the student know and able to do? It is the actual content that students should learn. Performance standards, this describes the abilities and skill that learners are expected to demonstrate in relation to the content standard and integration of 21st century skills. These 21st century skills which is the communication skills, collaboration skills, critical thinking skills, and creativity. Performance standard express the degrees or quality of proficiency that students are expected to demonstrate in relation to the content standard. It provides clear expectation for instruction, assessment, and student at work. It also answered the question, how will my student do their work? It helps teacher assess the extent to which the student have acquired the knowledge and applied the skills learned. It demonstrates conceptual understanding of content and skill acquisition. It represents real-life authentic tasks. This is an example of content standard and performance standard. For the content, grade 7 first quarter, numbers and number senses. For content standard, the learner demonstrates understanding of key concept of set and the real number system. For performance standard, the learner is able to formulate challenging situations involving set and real numbers and solve these in a variety of strategy. For the learning competency, the learner first or number one describe well-defined sets, subsets, universal sets, and the null set, and the cardinality of set. Competency are statement of skills. Learning competency, this refers to the knowledge, understanding, skills, and attitude that learners need to demonstrate in every lesson and or learning activity. Competency are statement of skill. It is what the student should be able to demonstrate on an independent and long-term basis. And it is often served as the basis for standards that specify the level of knowledge and skills required to successfully perform tasks. Unit objectives or learning objectives are specific knowledge or skill within that smaller time frame. It supports the identified competency and standard. When teachers develop unit objectives, they should ask themselves the question, what do I want my student to be able to do by the end of the unit? And in creating learning objectives or unit objectives, SMART goals are used, which is acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. Specific. It questions do the objective specify what participants need to achieve? Does it answer the question who, what, when, where, how, and why? Measurable. It is the objective measurable? How will you assess it? Achievable. Is the objective realistically achievable with the resources you have? Example, time. Relevant. Number one, are the objectives linked with competency that were identified in the analysis? Number two, are the objectives centered on the participant and not the activity itself? Number three, do they reflect the desired end of the learning experience, not the means or the process? Number four, do the objective answer the question, what is expected to change as a result of this learning activity? Time-bound. When do you want to achieve the set objective? This is the example Unit example, grade level 3 subject mathematics geometry standard CCSS math content 3 GA is represent geometry reasons with shapes and their attributes. Competencies, student will divide a variety of shapes into equal areas. Student will create fraction based on the shape division. Learning objectives. Student will learn to divide a square into 4 equal parts. Another one is the learning targets. Are the statement of intended learning based on standard, are in kid-friendly language and specific to the lesson for the day, and directly connected to assessment. Thank you for listening. For further explanation about this topic, my groupmate Lawrence Asansa will discuss the other topics in this module 3. Thank you for listening.
In this video, what I am going to discuss is about articulation of performance standards into competencies and learning targets. We have here our learning outcomes. First, at the end of this video, you are able to understand and differ performance standard, competency, and learning targets, followed by translating performance into competencies, and lastly, we have translate competency into learning targets. So this video is composed of 4 main topics. First, content standard and performance standards. Second, competency. Third, learning objectives and learning targets, and followed by translating competencies into learning targets. This video focused on how we are going to translate and articulate performance standards into competency and competencies into learning targets. So our first challenge is how we are going to understand those key terms, which are content standards, performance standards, competencies, learning objectives, and learning targets. Start with content standards and performance standards. So we have here an example of content standard and performance standards na makikita natin sa K-12 Mathematics Curriculum from Department of Education. So we have here a sample curriculum guide for grade 7 mathematics. We have here an example of curriculum guide from grade 7 mathematics. We have here first the content, patterns and algebra, followed by content standards. The learner demonstrates understanding of key concepts of algebraic expressions, the properties of real numbers as applied in linear equations, and inequalities in one variable. Basically, content standards, meaning those are broad statements that describe specific content areas that groups of students should learn at each grade level. On the other hand, we have performance standards. The learner is able to model situations using oral, written, graphical, and algebraic methods in solving problems involving algebraic expressions, linear equations, and inequalities in one variable. Meaning, these are skills that students needed for problem solving. So, ito yung mga skills na kailangan makuha o matutunan ng mga estudyante to meet the content standards. So, ano yung pinagkaiba nila? Anong pinagkaiba ng content standards and performance standards? From the word itself, content standards. These are content areas that students should learn at each grade level. Ito yung mga topic or these are the content areas na kailangan ng mga estudyanteng matutunan. Whereas yung performance standards naman, From the word itself, performance, those will be your expectation for instruction, expectation for assessment, and expectation for student work. On to competency. A competency is the capability to apply or use a set of related knowledge, skills, and abilities required to successfully perform critical work functions or tasks in a defined work setting. Competencies often serve as the basis for skill standards that specify the level of knowledge, skills, and abilities required for success in the workplace, as well as potential measurement criteria for assessing competency attainment. For example, we have here the learning competency na makikita din sa learning curriculum guide. The learner factors completely different types of polynomials. Polynomials with common monomial factor, difference of two squares, sum of difference of two cubes, perfect square trinomials, and general trinomials. Meaning, yung competency daw is, it is serve as the basis for skill standards that specify the level of knowledge, skills, and abilities required for success in the workplace, as well as potential measurement criteria for assessing competency attainment. Basically, competency, those are contents and topics that our students need to learn at the end of the course. So to picture out the whole topic, we have here the example of the curriculum guide para mas ma-picture out natin what are content standards, performance standards, and learning competency. So first we have the content, which is the patterns and algebra, followed by content standards, followed by performance standards, and performance standards followed by learning competency. So the learning competency in under patterns and algebra are the learner factors completely different types of polynomials, polynomials with common monomial factors, difference of two squares, sum of difference of two cubes, perfect square trinomials, and general trinomials. Second, the learner solves problems involving factors of polynomials. Dito napapasok yung learning objectives and learning targets. So if we are going to compare or differ the learning competency into learning objectives, mas measurable yung learning objectives kaysa sa learning competency. So, bakit? And let's now move on to learning objectives and learning targets. I know some of you na iniisip nyo na yung learning objectives and learning target is magkapareho lang. But they are not. So, meron silang pagkakaiba. At yun yung pagkakaiba nila is pwedeng mag-cause ng big impact when it comes to articulating and translating competencies into learning objectives and learning targets. So ano nga ba yung pinagkaiba nila? Objectives are direction-setting outcome-based statements. Objectives describe the measurable contribution of the transport system to achieving the goals. Targets are specific desired outcomes that support achievement of the objectives. Yung pinagkaiba nila is yung target tend to be precise and quantifiable. Ibig sabihin, yung target is more measurable. So, sabihin natin yung target is measurable compared sa objective. Ibig sabihin, objectives are vaguer than targets. Since we already know what are the content standards, performance standards, competencies, learning objectives, and learning targets, let's now move on to translating and articulating competencies into learning targets. Translating competencies into learning targets. So yung learning competency natin is we are going to break down the competency, the given competency na makikita natin sa curriculum guide into learning targets. And learning targets must be integrated with the Bloom's Taxonomy. So, dito napapasok yung Bloom's Taxonomy. So let's have a short review of what is Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a classification of the different objectives and skills that educators set for their students' learning objectives. So, Bloom's taxonomy is very important when making a lesson plan or learning objectives and learning targets. Kasi yung learning targets natin at learning objectives must be integrated with Bloom's taxonomy. In articulating or translating competency into learning targets, it's like a pinya. So hindi natin makakain yung pinya ng buo. So kailangan natin himay-himayin yung competency para makain. Para mas measurable o mas attainable yung lesson. And also for the effective learning and teaching process. Let's now move on to guidelines in writing learning targets. Based on increasing level of difficulty and challenge. So, nag-start tayo sa remembering sa bottom part ng Bloom's taxonomy, which is remembering. So, remembering, to find or remember information, memorizing information. So, remembering, those are questions that answers the what. So, more on identification. We have here an example of action verb na pwede nating magamit when creating learning targets and learning objectives. We have tell, uncover, show, state, define, name, write, recall, recognize, list, label, reproduce, identify, acquire, distinguish, state, order, locate, repeat, count, describe, enumerate, find, match, read, and so on and so forth. We have here an example of learning competency. So, yung learning competency natin is laging makikita sa curriculum guide when creating learning targets. So, the learner solves problems involving factors and polynomials. So, gagawan natin ng learning targets under remembering. So, at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to identify and define monomials, binomials, and polynomials. So, yung ginamit nating action verb is identify and define, which is under remembering. Let's now move on to comprehension. To understand the information and restate in your own words, paraphrasing, summarizing, and translating. So, nag-move tayo sa upper part ng Bloom's taxonomy. So, paakyat ng paakyat, pa-complex ng pa-complex. So, we have here the action verb. Comprehend, appreciate, select, indicate, illustrate, represent, formulate, and so on and so forth. For example, we have here also the example of learning competency. The learner solved problems involving factors of polynomials. And we have here the learning targets under comprehension. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to explain the difference between monomials, binomials, and polynomials. So yung ginamit nating action verb is explain. So, malaki yung pinagkaiba when it comes to complexity of the learning targets. So, compared sa remembering and comprehension. Let's now move on to application. To use information to solve problems, transfer abstract or theoretical ideas to actual situations, identifying connections and relationship of how they apply. Kailangan ng students na may apply kung ano yung natutunan nila sa remembering and comprehension. So, we could use this action verb, which are assess, change, chart, choose, demonstrate, determine, develop, establish, produce, relate, report, select, show, use, try, diagram, perform, make a chart, and so on and so forth. So it requires application of the topic, application of the knowledge they have gained from remembering and comprehension. So for example, we have here the example of learning competency. The learning solves problems involving factors of polynomials. So learning targets under application. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to solve problems involving multiplication and division of polynomials. So the students are being asked to solve problems involving multiplication and division of polynomials. So more complex na siya compared sa comprehension and remembering. Let's now move on to analysis. To take information apart, identifying components, determining arrangement, logic, and semantics. So we could use this action verb which are analyze, study, combine, separate, categorize, detect, examine, inspect, discriminate, and so on and so forth. For example, we have the learning competency here. The learner visualize and describes the different solid figures, cube, prism, pyramid, cylinder, cone, and sphere. So we have here the learning targets under analysis. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to illustrate the different geometrical solid figures. So yung ginamit nating action verb is illustrate. So the students are being asked to illustrate the different geometrical solid figures. Let's move on now to synthesis. To create new ideas or things, combining information to form a unique product requiring a creativity and originality. So in synthesis, so with the use of the knowledge and information they have gained from remembering, comprehension, analysis, so students are able to produce or to create a new or unique idea with the use of creativity and originality. So we could, in writing learning objectives and learning targets, we could use this action verb, which are written, plan, integrate, formulate, propose, specify, produce, organize, theorize, design, build, systematize, combine, summarize, restate, argue, and so on and so forth. For example, we have here the learning competency. The learner visualize and describe the different solid figures, cube, prism, pyramid, cylinder, cone, and sphere. So the learning targets under at the end of the lesson, the student will be able to formulate problems involving geometrical figures. So the students are asked to formulate problems. And lastly, we have the evaluation, the last part or the upper last part of the Bloom's taxonomy. To make judgments about knowledge, to make decisions, and supporting views requires understanding of values. So, yung evaluation is more applicable in real life situation kasi nga they are asked to evaluate. We have heard the example of the action verb which are evaluate, measure, appraise, select, check, evaluate, determine, support, defend, weigh, judge, justify, attach, criticize, and so on and so forth. So for example, learning competency, the learning visualize the describe the different solid figures, cube, prism, pyramid, cylinder, cone, and sphere. So under evaluation, we have the learning targets. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to prove problems and theorem involving geometrical figures. So the students are asked to prove problems and theorem. And that would be all for my report. Thank you for watching.